On the last night of the year, the world leans forward together. Phones glow, champagne pops, fireworks punch color into the sky. In homes and bars and crowded streets, people shout promises they don't yet know how to keep. This year will be different. This year will be better. In Oakland, the night sounded the same. Music thudding from car windows, laughter spilling out of downtown bars, the crack and hiss of fireworks echoing off concrete. But beneath the celebration ran a current of tension that never quite left the city. It lived in the way people watched each other on street corners, in the way sirens never fully slept, in the way certain neighborhoods learned to brace themselves for the after-midnight hours when joy blurred into chaos. Just before 2 a.m. on January 1st, 2009, the Fruitvale station was packed. The Bay Area Rapid Transit platform pulsed with bodies trying to get home. Young men in fresh sneakers and pressed jackets, couples leaning into each other, friends arguing about which stop was theirs. The air smelled like sweat, beer, and cold metal. Trains screamed in and out, carrying the remnants of the night across the city. Among the crowd was Oscar Grant, 22 years old. He had the kind of smile that came easily, the kind that made people feel safe around him. He wasn't famous, he wasn't wealthy. He was a grocery store worker, a son, a father to a young daughter who would wake up later that morning expecting a phone call that would never come. Oscar had spent the night celebrating with friends. There had been laughter, jokes, the harmless bravado of young men welcoming a new year. Somewhere along the way, an argument broke out on the train. Words exchanged, shoulders bumped, tempers flaring in that reckless way alcohol and adrenaline encourage. Nothing that hadn't happened 100 times before, nothing that should have ended the night in blood. But when the train pulled into Fruitvale, the argument spilled onto the platform. Voices rose, people stopped walking. Someone shouted, someone else pushed back. The crowd tightened, curiosity snapping into place like a hook. This was Oakland. Arguments could turn fast, and everyone knew it. Within minutes, Bay Area Rapid Transit police officers arrived. They moved with authority, hands already near their belts, scanning faces for threats. The crowd recoiled instinctively, some people backing away, others lifting phones, not to call for help, but to record. In 2009, this wasn't yet routine, but it was happening more and more. People didn't trust their memories anymore. They trusted their cameras. Oscar and several of his friends were pulled aside. Commands were shouted. Get down, hands behind your back, don't move. Oscar dropped to the ground, face down on the cold concrete. His cheek pressed against the platform. He remembers thinking, "This is stupid. This will be over in a minute." He remembers the weight of a knee near his neck, the rough scrape of gravel against his skin. Around him, chaos hummed. Someone yelled that they had the wrong guy. Someone else begged the officers to calm down. A woman screamed. The fireworks in the distance sounded like gunshots, or maybe the gunshots would soon sound like fireworks. It was hard to tell anymore. One officer stood up. His name was Johannes Messerli. In the seconds that followed, time bent. Messerli reached toward his belt. Later, he would say he meant to grab his taser. Later, lawyers would argue muscle memory, stress, confusion. Later, experts would slow the footage frame by frame, trying to understand how a single decision slipped past every safeguard. But in that moment, captured by multiple cell phone cameras from multiple angles, Messerli drew his gun. The sound cracked across the platform. A single shot. Oscar screamed. The crowd erupted. People shouted in disbelief, in rage, in horror. Someone yelled, "He shot him." Another voice cut through the noise, "They killed him." Oscar rolled onto his side, clutching his back. Blood spread beneath him, dark against the concrete. The officers froze, then moved, then froze again. Orders were shouted. Someone called for medical help. Someone else kept filming, hands shaking but steady enough to document the truth unfolding in front of them. Oscar Grant died later that morning. By sunrise, the world was still celebrating somewhere else. In Oakland, candles replaced fireworks. The news traveled fast. By dawn, shaky videos were everywhere, uploaded, shared, replayed. People watched in silence as the images burned themselves into memory. A young black man face down on the platform, an officer standing over him, the unmistakable recoil of a gunshot. For many, it wasn't just one death. It was a confirmation that the new year would look exactly like the old one. Oscar's mother learned the truth in fragments, phone calls that didn't quite make sense, news anchors speaking in careful tones, the sickening certainty that settles in before the words fully land. His daughter was too young to understand why her father wouldn't be coming home, only that the adults around her suddenly spoke in whispers. The city reacted like it always had, first with grief, then with anger. Protests erupted within days. Marches filled downtown streets. Signs rose into the air. Justice for Oscar. We are tired. This must stop. Police cars burned. Windows shattered. The line between mourning and uprising blurred until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. But even as the city burned with questions, another story was already forming beneath the surface, a quieter one. A story about what happens after the cameras stop recording. Because while the world argued about what it had seen, the system began doing what it always did, closing ranks, choosing language carefully, preparing explanations. The officer who fired the shot resigned. He wasn't arrested right away. Weeks passed, then months. The videos never went away, but outrage has a shelf life. New tragedies arrived. New headlines pushed old ones down the page. And slowly, a dangerous question began to surface. Would anyone actually be held accountable? For Oscar Grant, time had stopped at 2:01 a.m. on a cold concrete platform. For everyone else, it kept moving. And as the city waited, watching the legal system grind forward inch by inch, another truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about one man. It was about whether the first death of the year would be the first one forgotten. The videos were undeniable. The world had seen the gunfire. So why then, months later, was the officer still free? The cameras never stopped rolling, but justice moved at its own pace. In the weeks after the shooting, Oakland existed in a suspended state. Candle wax still stained sidewalks near the station. Handwritten signs clung to chain-link fences, their messages fading under rain and exhaust fumes. Every siren felt personal. Every police cruiser passing too slowly or too fast triggered a tightening in the chest. The videos had done something rare. They had unified outrage. People who had never agreed on anything before agreed on this. What happened on that platform should never have happened. The footage felt unmistakable, clear, final. A man restrained, an officer standing, a gun fired. And yet, as days turned into weeks, nothing happened. No arrest, no charges, just statements, investigations, administrative leave, carefully worded press conferences that said a lot without promising anything at all. Behind closed doors, attorneys were already working, not for the family, but for the system. Because the moment the trigger was pulled, a different clock had started ticking, one that measured risk, liability, precedent, One that asked not what was right, but what could be proven without breaking the structure that protected everyone wearing a badge. The officer resigned quietly. That alone sent a chill through the city. Resignation meant distance. It meant the case was slipping out of the realm of internal discipline and into something murkier, criminal accountability. And criminal accountability, when it came to police officers, was rare enough to feel mythical. The family waited. They waited for a knock at the door, for a phone call, for a moment that would signal the system had finally seen what the world had seen on those videos. Instead, they watched the narrative begin to change. The word that entered the conversation was mistake. Officials said it carefully, repeated it gently, framed it as tragedy, not crime. The officer intended to deploy his taser. Stress, confusion, the chaos of the moment, these were the explanations being floated into public consciousness like trial balloons. Experts appeared on television to talk about muscle memory. Commentators debated whether a uniformed officer should be judged by the same standards as an ordinary citizen. Each time the story shifted, the wound reopened. For the family, the suggestion that this was an accident felt like a second loss, not just of a son, but of truth itself. How could something captured so clearly be softened into ambiguity? And yet, it was working. Polls showed public opinion fracturing. Some still demanded justice, others began to hedge. If it was an accident, if he really thought it was a taser. The footage hadn't changed. The interpretation had. When the arrest finally came, nearly 2 weeks later, it felt less like relief and more like pressure being released from an overfilled container. Protesters had flooded the streets, businesses had boarded up windows, the city was bracing itself for an answer, any answer, before the anger tipped into something uncontrollable. The charge stunned nearly everyone. Not murder, not even second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter. The legal language landed like a dull thud. It carried the implication that death had occurred without intent, that while the outcome was tragic, the act itself lacked malice. For many watching, it felt like the system was already deciding the ending before the trial had even begun. The family stood before cameras, trying to hold themselves together as microphones crowded in. They spoke about accountability, about responsibility, about a life that could not be reduced to a legal technicality. Behind them, the city watched and waited again. The trial would not take place in Oakland. That decision came quietly, almost casually, wrapped in concerns about impartiality and jury bias. But everyone understood what it meant. Oakland was too close to the pain, too loud, too angry. Justice, it was implied, required distance from the platform, from the protests, from the people most affected. The case was moved hundreds of miles away. And with that move, something intangible was lost. The community that witnessed the killing would not witness the reckoning. The trial would unfold far from the murals, the vigils, the streets where chants still echoed at night. And in that courtroom, the story would be retold from the beginning, filtered through motions, objections, and legal definitions that stripped away emotion and replaced it with procedure. Jury selection took days. Potential jurors were asked what they had seen, what they believed, whether they could set aside videos burned into the public consciousness and judge the case on testimony alone. Many were dismissed. Some admitted they couldn't be impartial. Others claimed they could, even as their answers betrayed hesitation. Each dismissal felt like another narrowing of perspective. The prosecution faced an impossible task: prove criminal negligence beyond a reasonable doubt while countering a defense built on training, stress, and human error. They needed jurors willing to look at the video and still accept that an officer's fear did not outweigh a man's life. The defense, meanwhile, leaned heavily on sympathy. They spoke of a young officer overwhelmed by chaos, of split-second decisions made under pressure, of a tool belt designed poorly enough to confuse even a trained professional. They framed the shooting as every officer's nightmare, a moment they trained to avoid but could never fully eliminate. And slowly, subtly, the focus began to shift, away from the man on the ground towards the man holding the gun. Witnesses took the stand. Bystanders described shouting warnings, watching in disbelief, screaming as the shot rang out. Experts dissected the footage, pointing out angles, distances, the unmistakable shape of a firearm in the officer's hand. But the defense had experts too. They spoke with authority, with confidence. They explained how the brain behaves under stress, how fine motor skills degrade, how memory fills gaps with intention after the fact. They made confusion sound inevitable. They made tragedy sound unavoidable. And the jury listened. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered again, smaller this time, quieter. The cameras still came, but not like before. The nation's attention had shifted to other stories, other outrages. Inside, the fate of the case hinged on a single question: was this a crime or a mistake? When closing arguments ended, the courtroom felt hollowed out. The jury was sent to deliberate. Hours passed, then a day, then another. Each delay fed speculation. Commentators dissected every possible outcome. Legal analysts warned viewers not to expect too much. History, they reminded everyone, did not favor convictions in these kinds of cases. The family waited in silence. They had done everything they could, spoken, marched, endured the retelling of the worst moment of their lives in slow motion under fluorescent lights. Now the story belonged to 12 strangers behind a closed door. Outside, Oakland held its breath again, because everyone understood what was coming next, a verdict that would not just decide one man's fate, but signal what the system was willing to tolerate when the world was watching. After days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom rose to its feet. And as the verdict was read aloud, Oakland braced itself, knowing that no matter what the outcome, the city would never be the same again. The courtroom was so quiet, it felt unreal. Every bench was full, every seat taken. People stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The air carried the sharp scent of old wood, recycled air, and something else, anticipation heavy enough to taste. When the jury filed back in, the sound of footsteps echoed like a countdown. 12 strangers, 12 lives that had already returned to normal in most ways, except for this one moment that would follow them forever. They took their seats without expression, eyes fixed straight ahead. No one looked at the family. No one looked at the defendant. The judge asked the clerk to read the verdict. Everyone stood. For a heartbeat, the entire room felt suspended, like the moment just before a storm breaks, when even the wind seems to pause. And then the words came. Guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Not murder, not second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, instinctive and uncontrolled. Some people exhaled in relief, others inhaled sharply like they'd been struck. The family didn't move at all. They stood frozen, faces locked somewhere between disbelief and resignation. The officer remained still, no visible reaction, no collapse, no visible relief, just a slight tightening of the jaw, a breath carefully measured. He had avoided the word that carried the greatest weight. He had avoided the charge that might have marked him forever. But outside the courthouse, the meaning landed very differently. Word spread fast. Phones buzzed. Texts flew. Social media erupted. In Oakland, people gathered instinctively, the way they'd learned to do over years of shared trauma. At intersections, on sidewalks, outside police stations, outside City Hall. By nightfall, the city was alive again, but not with celebration, with fury. Protesters filled downtown streets, chanting, shouting, demanding answers that had already been denied. Police lines formed quickly, shields raised, batons visible, the familiar choreography of unrest snapping into place. Helicopters circled overhead, their lights sweeping across rooftops and faces alike. The verdict had spoken clearly enough for many. A life taken, worth less than a mistake. Windows shattered, fires flared, sirens screamed into the night. The same streets that had held candlelight vigils months earlier now glowed orange with burning debris. The city wasn't erupting because of one verdict, it was erupting because of every verdict before it. For years, people had watched similar cases end the same way. Charges reduced, officers acquitted, families left with press conferences instead of justice. This time, there had been video. This time, the world had watched, and still the system had blinked. As flames licked the edges of downtown, officials scrambled. Curfews were declared, mutual aid was requested, armored vehicles rolled in under the pretense of restoring order, though everyone knew what they were really there for: control. News anchors spoke urgently from safe distances, their voices strained as images of chaos played behind them. The question being asked wasn't whether the city would calm down, it was how much damage would be done before it did. Inside her home, Oscar's mother watched it all unfold on television, the same images, over and over. Flames, protesters, police lines, commentators debating whether the reaction was justified, whether anger had crossed into lawlessness. She turned off the TV. None of it captured what she felt. Because while the city burned, her grief remained unchanged, quiet, absolute, and permanent. The verdict hadn't given her peace. It hadn't returned her son. It hadn't even given her clarity. It simply confirmed what she already knew, that justice in this system came with conditions. Sentencing day arrived weeks later, stripped of spectacle. No protests, no fires, just the slow procedural march toward closure that never really feels like closure at all. The courtroom filled again, though fewer cameras showed up this time. The story had already moved on in the national consciousness. New tragedies had replaced old ones. Attention, once so fierce, had dulled. The judge spoke of balance, of accountability, of precedent. The sentence came down. 2 years in prison. 2 years. The words landed heavily, then hollowed out. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some people shook their heads. Others stared straight ahead, eyes glossy but dry. The officer stood silently, his future suddenly measured in months rather than decades. With time served in credits, everyone knew what 2 years really meant. He would walk free far sooner than anyone expected. The courtroom emptied slowly. Outside, the air felt colder somehow. The officer entered prison quietly. No fanfare, no ceremony, just intake forms, a uniform, and a cell that was never meant to hold him for long. He was housed separately for his own safety, watched closely, counted carefully. Time passed differently there. Days blurred together, nights stretched endlessly, but unlike most men behind bars, his sentence came with an expiration date everyone could see approaching. Meanwhile, Oscar's daughter grew older. She learned to read, to write, to ask questions. Questions no one knew how to answer. 11 months later, the officer was released. No announcement, no press conference, just paperwork and a quiet exit through a side door. He stepped into daylight a free man, his debt to the system officially paid. For many in Oakland, it felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to scar. Protests flared briefly, then faded. People were tired. Not because they didn't care, but because caring had begun to feel like screaming into a void that never answered back. The city tried to move on. Murals faded, vigils became anniversaries, names were spoken less frequently, though never forgotten. But something had shifted. Because this case had done more than expose a single act, it had pulled back the curtain on how accountability was measured, weighed, and ultimately diluted. And it left behind a question that refused to go away. If this, with video, with witnesses, with the world watching, was the best outcome possible, what chance did anyone else have? Years later, the platform at Fruitvale Station looks ordinary. Trains still arrive, crowds still gather, people still argue, laugh, rush home after long nights. Most pass through without ever knowing exactly where it happened or how close they are standing to history. But for those who remember, the space feels different, heavier, like the ground itself remembers. The case was over, the sentence served, the city scarred. But the story wasn't finished, because the legacy of that night would reach far beyond one platform, one verdict, one city. When the fires burned out, Oakland was left with silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that follows resolution, but a heavier, unsettled quiet. The kind that lingers after shouting stops, after sirens fade, after the city realizes there will be no more answers coming. The verdict had been read, the sentence served, the streets repaired. On paper, the case was finished, but the damage it exposed was still raw, still pulsing beneath the surface, impossible to seal with plywood and press releases. In Oakland, people returned to routines out of necessity. Trains ran on schedule again. Stores reopened. Sidewalks were swept clean of glass and ash. Tourists passed through unaware that just months earlier, these same streets had been battlegrounds. Yet for those who remembered, normal never fully returned. Because once you see how the system responds when the world is watching, how carefully accountability is measured, how cautiously justice is rationed, you can't unsee it. At Fruitvale Station, commuters moved quickly, eyes down, earbuds in. The platform looked like any other: concrete, steel, fluorescent lights humming overhead. There was no plaque, no official marker, nothing to tell strangers what had happened there. Only memory marked the spot. Those who knew slowed unconsciously. Some avoided it altogether, choosing different cars, different routes. Others stood there deliberately, forcing themselves to remember, to feel the weight of what had been lost. Because this was where Oscar Grant took his last breath, and for many, that mattered more than any verdict ever could. Oscar's family learned to live with a permanent absence. Grief did not soften with time, it changed shape. Some days it was quiet, almost manageable. Other days it arrived without warning, sharp and overwhelming. Birthdays, holidays, ordinary moments that reminded them of everything that would never happen. His daughter grew older with questions no one could answer cleanly. Who was her father? Why wasn't he there? Why did it happen? The adults around her tried to explain in fragments, careful not to pass down anger too heavy for a child to carry. But some truths resist simplification. Some realities insist on being felt before they are understood. Oscar became a story before she fully understood he was a person, and that too was part of the tragedy. Across the country, the case echoed far beyond Oakland. Legal scholars debated it, activists cited it, police departments quietly reviewed training manuals and use of force policies, not always out of moral reckoning, but out of fear. Fear of cameras, fear of lawsuits, fear of being the next department forced into the spotlight. Cell phone footage changed everything. Before, stories could be shaped by reports, statements, and internal reviews. After Fruitvale, the public saw something different. Raw, unfiltered reality, captured by ordinary people who refused to look away. It became harder to dismiss victims as threats when the footage contradicted the narrative. Harder, but not impossible. Because even with video, even with witnesses, even with global attention, the outcome still landed softly for the person who pulled the trigger. That contradiction lingered. It haunted conversations about reform, accountability, and trust. If this case, with its evidence, its visibility, its outrage, ended the way it did, what happened in the shadows? Reforms were promised: new training protocols, body cameras, de-escalation emphasis, reviews of equipment placement, each announcement framed as progress, each one accompanied by cautious optimism. Some changes were real, others were cosmetic. Body cameras recorded more interactions, but footage was still controlled, released selectively, interpreted strategically. Training emphasized restraint, but enforcement remained inconsistent. Policies changed, but culture shifted slowly, if at all. For many communities, trust did not return. Because trust isn't rebuilt with policy, it's rebuilt with patterns, with accountability that feels proportional, with consequences that match harm, and that remained elusive. Years passed. New names joined old ones. New cases sparked new protests. New videos went viral, each one greeted with the same familiar cycle: shock, outrage, debate, exhaustion. Oscar Grant's name was still spoken, but now it was part of a longer list. A list no city wanted to grow. A list that asked the same question over and over again. How many times does this have to happen before something truly changes? At Fruitvale Station, nothing looked different, but everything felt different. The ground remembered. It remembered the shouting, the gunshot, the scream that cut through celebration and turned a new year into a permanent scar. History doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly, embedded in ordinary places, asking whether we will carry its lessons forward or repeat them. For Oakland, the night of January 1st was no longer just a tragedy. It was a mirror, one that reflected the gap between justice promised and justice delivered, between what the system claimed to value and what it ultimately protected. The world moved on. It always does. But for those who were watching, really watching, that night became a line they could not cross back over. A moment when faith was tested and found wanting. When celebration gave way to clarity. Because the most unsettling truth was not that a man died on New Year's Day. It was that even when the world saw it happen, even when the city burned with grief and rage, the outcome still felt inevitable. And that realization, that sinking, devastating understanding, may have been the deepest wound of all. This story is not just about one platform, one officer, or one verdict. It's about what happens when accountability collides with power, about how justice is shaped not only by facts, but by fear, precedent, and protection, about how communities learn, slowly and painfully, where the limits of the system truly lie. And it leaves us with a question that still has no answer. If this was justice, what would injustice look like? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes for more real true crime stories. Turn on notifications so that you do not miss the next true crime story.